I'm just going to essentially redirect over to you, Mark. I'll leave this slide up until you've finished doing your introduction, then I'll take it down. So thank you. Over to you.
Okay, welcome everybody to this session, Sociocracy in Worker Co-ops Roundtable. In this session, we're going to address three questions. We're going to look at what is sociocracy, bearing in mind that not everyone here is going to be totally up to speed around that. We're going to look at sociocracy at scale, how does it work? And finally, we're going to look at is sociocracy compatible with other emerging models of workplace democracy? And we're going to cut backwards and forwards from a UK and a US worker co-op perspective within that. I'm facilitating the session, although I have experience in this and I will be able to chip in. All three members of the panel, or two members of the panel and myself, are members of the Sociocracy for All Co-op Circle. I'm the facilitator of that circle, and I'm a cooperative development worker in the UK. And over the recent years, I've seen a rapid growth in the use of sociocracy, particularly in worker co-ops and in the co-ops I'm supporting. So my interest and enthusiasm in sociocracy has been demand-led, but definitely speaks to my governance geek. We've got John McNamara, Senior Cooperative Development Specialist at Northwest Cooperative Development Center in the USA. John has many years of practical experience in the worker co-op world, both as a co-op member and developer, and is a long-standing member of the Sociocracy for All Co-op Circle. And then not too far away from me in the UK, we have Abbie Kempson, who is leader of the SOFA Co-op Circle. Abbie is a long-standing member of flagship worker co-op Uni Grocery in Manchester in the UK. And Abbie is also a founding member of a new cooperative development body, which is itself a sociocratic worker cooperative, and that's the People's Support Cooperative. So first of all, we're going to look at what is sociocracy, and I'm going to hand over to Abbie for that. Check.
Thanks very much, Mark. So I don't know if we want to start sharing the slides, John. Okay. Thank you. So I added a couple here. So what is sociocracy? Well, it's a governance system, and it's very heavily based in the values that we all share from the ICA values and principles, those of us in the co-op movement. So sociocracy is all about creating a way for people to practice a sort of deeply democratic form of sharing power in their organisations. And there's four key aspects of sociocracy. One is consent decision making, which you'll find many co-ops in the UK certainly have embraced with enthusiasm. The second is circle working, so being able to make decisions in smaller groups for efficiency and effectiveness. The third is the way that the circles are connected within the governance system. And the fourth is elections based, so how to have very open, transparent elections where people are able to talk through why they are nominating somebody for a particular position and make that decision by consent. So what drew me to sociocracy was its great fit with our values and principles, and thinking about how we can empower all of the members in a cooperative to have a voice in governance and in management. So we have seen, as Mark mentioned, lots and lots of interest in the UK, and I think the last 5 years particularly. And Mark and I have particularly noticed that tech co-ops are very interested in sociocratic governance, particularly those using agile or lean methodologies as they develop new software, and they're wanting to sort of bring that approach into how they're making decisions together. And using consent decision making is a great way to do that. And platform co-ops as well, where we're seeing people in different sites, perhaps who never meet, who are able to use sociocratic methods to have really good meetings online, as all of us have got used to over the pandemic. And then we're also seeing lots and lots of worker co-ops, as Mark said, who are looking for different ways of doing governance, and particularly worker co-ops who are in periods of growth. So as they add more members in and they don't want to go for a traditional, more hierarchical governance structure, perhaps with a board of directors elected and a management committee, we find worker co-ops looking for new ways of accommodating growth, and sociocracy as we'll get to in the next question, is one of the ways that lots of us are thinking about bringing new members into our co-ops and not losing that flatter structure ethos. So I just saw in the chat, the difference between consent and consensus is quite a big subject. I wonder if we could come to that in a little while, if that's okay. I'll write that down. Next slide, please, John. So this is my co-op, Unicorn Grocery. We're in Manchester in the northwest of England, and we have 70 member directors, and we've been practicing collective governance since the beginning, nearly 26 years now. So we are, to the best of my knowledge, the largest worker co-op in the UK that still operates with a model of all members as directors of the co-op. And we still make decisions together in general meetings of all 70 directors for the larger strategic decisions and some of the bigger operational ones as well. And we started to experiment with Sociocracy nearly 4 years ago now. We first started, but over the last 2 years in particular, we've been implementing. And for us, it was about finding a new way of being able to keep our values as a radical worker co-op, not go down the route of electing a board and a management committee, and be able to work in a way that worked for us. So we have now, as you can see from my very basic representation in this diagram here, this isn't that representative of how we work, because it's this is like a 2D version of the 3D structure with people connected in different ways in our co-op. But we are all working in sociocratic circles now using consent decision making. I think that's probably way over my few minutes, so I'm going to hand over to John.
Sure, and yeah, so I guess, just talking about in the US experience, in our area in the Pacific Northwest, I'm based in Olympia, Washington. There are roughly 4 co-ops that are using Sociocracy. Polka Tech is a acupuncture college that teaches and practices acupuncture. They use Sociocracy. Our table is a multi-stakeholder co-op with consumers and farm workers managing it, and then Twisted Straight Fiber is trying to start a fiber mill for animal fiber on the peninsula, and then finally Blue Scorcher. And most of them, I have to say, I don't know a lot about them. One thing I would say about all of these, with the exception of Blue Scorcher, is they tend not to be very engaged with the cooperative community, and so they really have some work to do in terms of Principle 6. But we do know a little bit about Blue Scorcher. We've worked with them, and this is sort of their map. And again, to give an idea on how this works. So not everybody at Blue Scorcher is a member. And so, but they all participate in the managing and operations of the co-op. And I think that's kind of the point here within Sociocracy, is that the kind of the managing and governance tends to get a little bit more blurry. And I think that's true for worker co-ops in general, because the lived experience of workers in the workplace means that boards are going to be thinking about more policies than maybe a consumer board might think of. So working conditions, wages can often be board topics. But this is how their system's set up. So they're a cafe and a bakery. And so each of the departments have their own circle that operate autonomously unless they need to step into or get resources from other circles. So basically the bread department, they make all the decisions about menus or rather recipes and sourcing, etc. Likewise, cafe and prep is going to talk about the menus, etc. And then each of them, this kind of shows the linkage. So each circle has what's called a lead person that's appointed by either the general circle, and then also they elect a representative up from the circle. So you have sort of two-way communication. So the lead is supposed to make sure that the circle is getting information from the general circle and also making sure meetings are happening, et cetera. And the representative is also there to bring information back to the general circle. The board of directors, again, this is where corporate laws don't always reflect what you're trying to do. So sociocracy has to kind of merge into the corporate structure, which requires a board of directors. Sometimes like in Sociocracy for All, which is a 501c3, they've changed that to the mission circle. So the idea of the mission circle is to focus on the mission. And this is where I think one of the ideas of sociocracy is that it creates a hierarchy of work, not a hierarchy of power. So the idea is that the command and control is not really there, since people are engaging in consent and agreeing to what they are doing. You don't have the same sort of command and control that you would have in a traditional hierarchy, but you do have a structured way of organizing work so that people are focused on their model. And yeah, I think I might hand it back to Mark for the next question. That might be the best way to go.
Yeah, so that's perfect timing for us to move on to the next question. We are getting some questions in the chat, some of which I'm dealing with. There's quick and easy answer, but there's certainly stuff that we can pick up in the Q&A at the end. And I see Abbie's responding to some of those as well. So the next question we have is about sociocracy at scale. How is it working? Showing the potential limits of sociocracy as worker co-ops grow.
Well, you know, I think, you know, in some ways, Abbie and Unicorn might be one of the larger worker co-ops that are using sociocracy, but I find with things like sociocracy or even policy governance that how it's practiced in the field is not always how it looks in the book, and because people tend to, you know, force it into their own system. And so I do want to talk about two larger organizations. I would say they are sociocracy-ish, for the better word. And what I mean is that they kind of look like sociocracy, but they don't use sociocracy. The first would be Union Cab, which I was a member of for 26 years. So Union Cab, after some social auditing, the members decided to pull discipline away from management and set up a peer review structure in which there were a number of councils to consider behavior, also offer mediation, have stewards support for people to work through the policy director, and then appeals process. This then led the management team to also break off into a team management system in which these different teams would handle operational sort of what would be managerial functions. We still had managers, but their main role was to help coordinate the teams and implement the policies. So the operations team, for instance, took over managing public complaints. And through that process of actually being able to engage and have a team response to how public complaints and how the co-op was seen by its customer base, we're actually able to develop new trainings and interventions that reduce complaints by over 60% in the first year, which, you know, with a cab company, when your phone number is on the side of your doors, it's pretty easy to rack up a lot of complaints. And then the board of directors kept its process of its committee structure to actually develop policy. So what all this meant in reality was the peer review process ran about $35,000 a year for the wages of running the peer review. And the other rest of it was lumped under what we call democracy pay in our budget. And that also ran about $35,000. So both really less than, you know, what a full-time manager for either of those positions would be doing, and it also engaged the membership. So when I left, out of the 220 members of the co-op, there were roughly 80 members who were engaged in some way other than their actual day job, that or night job, as the case may be. So in addition to being a cab driver, dispatcher, or you know, a bookkeeper, at least 80, over a third of the co-op was engaged then in one of these teams or councils. And so it really also developed a much more engaged membership as a whole. The other one that probably most people know about is Rainbow Grocery, and I don't have a good chart for them, but you know, they are a 210 member worker cooperative grocery store in San Francisco. They do over $50 million in sales. So they're organized without managers. They have 14 semi-autonomous departments. They call them departments. So Sociocracy would call them circles. And they all use consensus within that instead of consent, which, as Abbie mentioned, can be, that could be its probably own full day discussion about the difference between consensus and consent. And then they have a steering committee that the departments elect people to that help coordinate between the different departments, and then a board of directors, again, primarily because the state law requires a board of directors, but the board also serves as sort of a bottom line for legal issues. The membership meets 4 times a year and often has a lot of the same similar powers as the board does, which would, so any changes to policies around hiring, firing, benefits, the business model, or wages would require both the membership and the board to be engaged on it. And then a big part of, I think, within worker co-ops, in terms of governance that we don't always think about is really accountability. Like I mentioned with Uni Co-Op, the complaints and then the disciplinary process were democratized and made transparent. Likewise, the departments at Rainbow are self-managed. They have a coordinator that they can defer some powers to, but almost all discipline is handled within the department unless it rises to a civil rights issue. And then the Civil Rights Advocacy Committee would deal with it. So this means that, within the departments, they're setting their own rules and their own structure, then meet again with the membership meeting to connect it to the overall vision and engagement. So people are engaged kind of both in governance and management during their everyday work. And I think is that where I can send it back or to get a response?
So, John, are you looking for some response?
Yeah, I think those are the 2 big examples of scale. And I want to say that one of the things about Sociocracy is that a small organization can have one circle that just does everything, right? If it's 3 people, you don't need to have different circles. But then as you grow, you can, to look back at that, if I can go back a few, as you can see, you can add circles or break circles down as you need, and you can expand it out. And I don't know if we have a really good map of a large organization. I'm not sure what the largest organizations are, but I think there's.
Yeah, I mean, we can probably find examples of non-cooperative large organizations that are using Sociocracy at scale. We're certainly seeing some large multi-stakeholder co-ops, and there was a question in the chat about non-worker cooperatives and how are they using Sociocracy, and I dropped in there that we're finding it particularly attractive to multi-stakeholder co-ops, some of whom are basically implementing it from day one, which speaks to your comment there about going from the sort of basically one circle to multiple circles, and how do you bake it in from day one so this stuff happens seamlessly rather than seeing like a painful process and to create these new circles as the organization grows to scale. Abbie, do you want to come in on this question? We've got about 5 minutes left on it.
Well, I could certainly echo what you're saying. I mean, I know of a couple of multi-stakeholder co-ops in Manchester, one of which is small and wanting to be sociocratic from day one and bring in the various stakeholders by beginning to create circles as they grow. And that's very exciting. So we've been talking to them about what we're doing at Unicorn and practicing Principle 6 by sharing what's worked for us and what hasn't and giving them a bit of a hand. And there's another larger, well-established multi-stakeholder co-op in Manchester they've been sociocratic for quite a long time, but looking to really try and get that wider engagement from the non-worker members in their multi-stakeholder co-op. And I think this is really interesting territory because, especially in the UK, we've seen so much interest in it in the last 5 years, but I'd say the last 2 or 3 in particular, loads more co-ops coming into this. I'm really keen to see how this does scale up for other people, and particularly in the multi-stakeholder co-ops, and just see what happens in another 3, 4, 5 years if we get back together and report on the UK co-op movement. certainly at Unicorn, the scale, the growth in our membership was very much the driver for finding Sociocracy in the first place. And we have been fairly static actually for the last sort of couple of years at the 70 member mark. And I don't think, for various reasons, that our sociocratic governance system would scale up much beyond that. But that's probably because, as much as anything, we have strong physical constraints, the size of our building, the size of our meeting room. We still want to have everybody in the room as directors of the business, as members of the business, 3 to 6 times a year. And we just can't, we're packed to the rafters. So partly it's that, but I think 70 is pretty good going for a sociocratic, pretty flat governance system. But I'll be interested to see how other things develop.
Abbie, we've got a couple of minutes yet on this question. There's a question in the chat around, do you find that cross-circle communication is a challenge? If not, what mechanisms are used to bridge that gap? Check.
So not really. I mean, we've been a devolved governance system at Unicorn. We've had devolved governance for a long time. So we've had teams who have been trusted to get on with their bit of the business and manage that function. So we've got long-standing systems like a weekly newsletter with little updates from different bits of the business. We have a central forum meeting which brings together reps from various parts of the co-op, and that is mostly about information flow rather than decision making. So we tend to find that we're pretty much all up to date with what's going on in the different bits of the business. Particularly helps that we're a single site co-op, so we're all in the same building, in the same space, so there's a lot of informal communication going on. And that's why we've taken a more networked approach to sociocratic governance. So we're connected via sort of the more organic links across the co-op. So we are organised into 3 different departments, as I showed on that diagram on the slide. But it's much more complicated than that. So we've been using some software to create a 3D networking style map, which really shows how the communication flow works. But so far, so good for that. And also we come together every fortnight as a membership to have a training session and look at all sorts of different topics and things. And that really keeps us all in the loop with what people are doing, because we hear updates then, particularly around new products on the shelf and things like that. So yeah, we're doing pretty well.
Great, cheers, Abbie. That takes us nicely up to our last question. So we've got 10 minutes on this question before we then have a 15-minute Q&A. Really interesting stuff happening in the chat. But we're going to move on to, and I think, John, you're going to start off with this. Should sociocracy have an easier word to describe it, basically? Is sociocracy compatible with other emerging models of workplace democracy? So we're looking at union co-ops and solidarity staff models. Check. Over to you, John.
Yes. So, forgive me if this seems like a really tenuous connection, but I really wanted to, I think it's important to talk about the Uni Co-op model because it's been a growing force in the United States and now in the UK and Canada. There are efforts to bring this together, and this is where worker co-ops are also unionized through a collective bargaining agent and usually have a collective bargaining agreement in place. And so one of the ways it connects to sociocracy is that one of the principles within sociocracy is that decisions are not made permanently, right? The idea is that you have sort of a review by date. Sociocracy kind of has this almost real experiment process where you create a hypothesis and then you test it and then you review to see if the hypothesis was proven or not. And so the idea might be you would establish a policy for 6 months and then at the end of the 6 months decide if you want to keep going with it. And so in some ways that sounds a lot like a contract. And for union co-ops, right, the union can actually, through the contract, have a role in helping those policies be in place for like 2 years or whatever the length of the contract is. So that's my very tenuous link to it, but I think they would still be very compatible. I do want to say, just recently, I chair the executive committee for the U.S. Union Co-op Council, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. And we just recently put out a statement about co-op development and how co-op developers should be engaging in unionized workplaces that are seeking to convert, and recognizing that union co-ops and labor unions are more of a both and situation, not an either or. They both share values of human dignity, societal change, and solidarity. And if labor unions can often be key partners for worker cooperatives, and I would say even cooperatives in general. One, because unionized workplaces are already practicing workplace democracy through electing their leaders, through negotiating the labor agreements, and even choosing which union they want to work with. You can read the full statement at the US Federation's website. I have the link there, and maybe it can get put in the chat. I don't know, but then this is kind of what the model looks like. This is a traditional model with a traditional hierarchy, but there's absolutely no reason that the manager itself couldn't be a circle or a team, but where the worker owners or members are also part of the bargaining unit, and they both elect a board of directors and then a union committee, and then the board appoints a manager, and the union committee is there to negotiate on behalf of the workers over compensation and working conditions. And then the added benefit is that depending on what the union has, there may be access to other union benefits such as healthcare or tuition. But more importantly, the role of the union is to create societal labor power and to be able to really change core things in our society that help all workers, regardless of their workplace. So things like, of course, the 8-hour day, the fight for 15 in the United States are both union-led initiatives, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. A standalone co-op isn't going to be able to do that. Co-ops can, of course, create workplaces based on human dignity and have more economic power for their members, but in able to move the needle at the societal level, there needs to be a different engagement. And so this is a way of also helping to move the co-op model more into the policy at the state and federal level. So yeah, this is some of the advantages. Unions, co-ops can build labor power through solidarity. There's also, of course, information on prevailing wages. I think this is something that I learned when we were studying Mondragon, they saw unions as valuable for that. And then, of course, the collective bargaining agreement itself can manage many of the policies that the board might normally be fighting back and forth on over time. And the union can be there to help that for fairness. And then finally, it provides as a watchdog on both management and the board, similar to the, I think, the social committees in the Mondragon structure. And that's part of one of the models of how the Union Co-op model is looking to work in the US. And then finally, I think just connecting it all to the co-op identity, I think really the connecting unions and worker co-ops, or even to, I think, consumer and producer co-ops should also see the people who work there as key stakeholders in their organizations. And in some ways, consumer co-ops and producer co-ops are effectively collective bargaining groups for their members. And so the workers certainly should be afforded that same ability to collectively bargain, but it engages the values of equality and solidarity, the ethical values of the cooperative identity, and finally concern for community. That's my spiel.
Abbie, do you want to come in on this question?
So this is a question I feel like I know a lot less about than John, looking at sort of these different forms. I know that, in fact, actually, Mark, probably better hand it back to you. You know more than I do, I think, about the union, the union model. I think it's really interesting, and there's definitely more of an interest, I think, in worker co-ops in the UK. It's certainly been mentioned a lot in the last sort of year or two, but it's not something that my co-op does. I know that there's a group forming around this with various people from Co-op College and Co-op UK and so on. So I'll be interested to see where that goes. But yeah, we've always been, and I talk about this a little bit in the case study that's being shared in the chat, we've always been a co-op that's sort of thought that if you're doing it right as a worker co-op with a deeply participatory democratic structure, why would you need a union? And that was certainly my view for a long time. And I've very much changed around. So personally, I think there's a huge amount of scope for this. But back to Mark.
Cheers, Abbie. Yeah, so I'm involved in this group in the UK that's looking to promote and develop union co-ops. We're behind the States in this. Certainly in worker co-ops and consumer co-ops as well, have always been very open and supportive of unions. I used to be the branch secretary in SUMA, probably I think we claim to be, I think we still are or were, the largest equal pay worker co-op in the world. We had about 80% union membership there of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, one of our more radical unions in the UK. Yeah, it was a really interesting dimension. And I think the interesting thing about it and where socioxy might come in is certainly if you wanted to give the union a governance role, in which most of the union co-op models do, I think our existing work co-ops would be quite suspicious of that. And I think creating a circle around it, and one of the things around socioxy, it allows boundaries to blur a bit and bleed, where you can get you're blurring the strategic and the executive, but you can also blur the co-op into the outside world. And so I think that might be quite a useful tool in the box when we start to look at it. We've got a big conference coming up at the end of the summer, and that's certainly one of the issues that we're going to be exploring. Check. So unless you want to come back on that, John.
No, one thing I was just thinking about too is, and of course the other side of it is that I think co-ops can, in some cases, also teach labor unions a lot about democracy as well. And depending on, of course, which union you're working with, but it is. I think using the term of blurring is, I think, a great concept around it.
Yeah, and we have also been, as co-op developers on the ground, been developing great relationships with some of the new emerging unions around freelancers like IWGB, and also some of the work being done with cycle couriers by the IWW, which is my union. So even though I'm self-employed as a cooperative developer, I'm part of the IWW. So I think then we should move on to, I'm going to change my view to gallery so I can see you all. So we've got a sort of hard deadline of 7:10 to finish, so you can all have your break. Please, just if you're familiar with using the reactions button, if you can raise your hand. I've just raised mine. I'm just lowering it again. But if you're finding that you're not, because I'm on multiple screens, you're not getting through, then feel free to unmute and chip in. So has anyone got a question for Abbie, John, or even me? Or can we have an early break? So there's an interesting follow-up. So Fred's hands up. Fred, can you unmute and ask your question?
And bear the silence. No, a million questions. My main question is about the relationship between the general manager. Okay. The main question is about the relationship between the general manager and the other members of the general circle unicorn. How the general manager is chosen, how that person is accountable to others. Does the person have greater formal decision-making power or not, or the circle rules rule and that's it?
So Fred, this is sort of an easy one. We don't actually have a general manager at Unicorn. We've never had anybody in that sort of elected position. We do so much shared power, shared work at Unicorn. We're a multitasking co-op, so nobody has a specialist role where they're just doing that. Everybody works on the shop floor, serving customers on the till, stocking the shelves, doing various bits and pieces that's at front of house. And most of us then have one or two back office roles as well. So whether that's in finance or marketing or whatever it is. So what we do is we have a system, we have a team of people, and I don't know why this word was used, but back in 1996, we decided to call them floor walkers. And they are the general manager or the shop manager by the hour or by the 2 hours. So there's about 22, I think, at the moment, floor walkers at Unicorn. And they meet every fortnight or every month, depending on how much business they're dealing with at any point, just to make sure they have the systems and processes in place. But we're very democratic in that way. We don't really have any elected roles in that sort of sense. We do have elected chair and co-chair to facilitate our general meetings. That changes every year, and elected secretary. But in terms of how we operate the business and do the management, it's very shared, collective management. Check.
And Mark, I wouldn't mind responding to Peter's question about the boards, if I could. Okay. So at Blue Scorcher, the board of directors, it's this body that's really created by the state and required for the corporate structure. But in their model, the person who would kind of most aligned to the general manager is called the leader of the general circle. And that person's appointed by the board and is a member of the board. There's also 3 outside directors who are appointed by the board to bring in special issues. So for instance, the executive director of the Northwest Co-op Development Center sits on the board as the co-op expert. They have somebody else who is an attorney that's a friend of the co-op that sits on as a legal expert, et cetera. And they have 3 people. They're not compensated other than maybe they get dinner at board meetings. But then, the role of the board is in Sociocracy is not the traditional command and control role that you would normally see in an organization, because one, things are being done by consent. Their role is really to provide the overall structure and, maybe some budgeting, et cetera. But everyone's working under the concept of consent. So if there isn't consent to a policy by the other circles, it's not going to be a policy. So nobody is being forced to do something they don't want to do. And so it really kind of upends the concept of, of governance and management in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'd like to come in briefly on that as well. One of the ways that I'm managing to get sociocratic governance to fit UK corporate governance and the legal structures available is almost like an adaptation of Carver governance or policy governance, which, if you're not familiar with it, is basically it's like an hourglass for the organization, where you've got the board above, you've got the executive sort of running the doing the stuff, the department heads and stuff below, and they intersect at one person, the chief exec. And effectively, what Sociocracy doing is replacing that chief executive officer with a circle. So the general circle is effectively a collective CEO. So that's one of the ways to think of it, and talk to that general manager question as well. We've still got a fair bit of time. I notice Jerome's got a question. Do you want to unmute and ask your question, Jerome?
Yes, can you hear me? My question, I guess, well, I have several, and now to John's latest response, I also have a question, and particularly, I guess, how do you ensure that consent is actually achieved? So I mentioned Element's critique of consent-based logic in his latest book. So, things like peer pressure, if you can give the illusion that, that there is consent when there actually isn't. Also, I would be curious, second question, do you consider sociocracy to be a type of democracy? Is it a different, fundamentally different type of a governance construct? And lastly, do you see the social councils at Mondragon as being a type of sociocracy or as a parallel phenomenon? Thank you.
I think in terms of the first question, there's always, at least what I tell clients is that there's always 2 structures in the organization, the formal and informal, and the informal tends to operate around systems of oppression. And so regardless of, even if you have sociocracy where it may provide rounds and give everybody the opportunity to speak or to, block consent, that doesn't get rid of the informal structures of oppression. And so I think organizations still have to be working on that and creating an environment to break down those structures. And so I think Sociocracy provides some tools to do that, but it doesn't by itself get rid of that. And so, you know, and then I'm not sure if I remember the second question, or if maybe Mark.
Is sociocracy the same as democracy? Is it a type of democracy, or is it a parallel type of system?
Right. Yeah, and maybe Abbie or Mark want to jump in. I mean, I would say it's a form of participatory democracy. So part of the process is, by the time you get to a decision, there's been discussion of forming the question that you're deciding on by everybody. So the decision itself is, in my experience, at least with few exceptions in the Sociocracy for All group, by the time we get to making a decision, everyone's been participating in forming the question, that you're at consent already. But maybe Abbie and Mark have some different perspectives.
No, I think, John, that's exactly it. The difference for me is that sort of democratic systems, or at least traditionally, the question is predefined and then people get a vote, whereas in the sociocratic system using consent, the question is shared and lots of people are able to contribute to that in circles. So you get that space, that emergent space in a group to do that work well. I think also just the difference of consent used well, because all of these things, as John was sort of saying, that it's a tool, but it does depend on the group, it depends on the people and how you're using it. But used well, consent means that you don't have a sort of majority view taking over. You've got space to listen to all the views. And we try all the time, sort of keep reiterating this, objections are welcome in consent. So in consensus systems, or in majority voting democratic systems, often if you are not in agreement, then you're sort of seen as a problem and you personify the problem of not being in agreement, or the losing side in voting. But if you can manage to get that sort of trust basis and that sort of great working environment together to use consent well, then all objections are welcome, and we try and sort of depersonalize them as much as possible and just look at the issue when you're making a decision. And I think in my experience too, from being in like lots and lots of different decisions now in my co-ops and in Sociocracy for All, very rarely do we find an objection that we can't work with. We talk about integrating objections in consent, finding a way to make it safe enough for everybody to feel like they can agree to try something out, with a review date, with then the next iteration of trying something different if it didn't work out quite as much as we wanted to. So it's quite freeing and liberating that we don't have to wait for perfect, and we don't have to wait for everyone to be sort of jumping up and down with excitement. We can just try something. If there's not a risk that's too big to take, we can learn and we can try again. And I've really enjoyed being part of that in my various circles. Check.
So I'm just checking. I've got no more hands up. We are 2 minutes off our break. I was frantically.
I had one other question.
Right. About Mondragon.
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm not sure about how much it looks like Sociocracy, because I think Mondragon also tends to use parliamentary decision making as a rule, if I'm not mistaken. But since Fred's here, I bet he might be able to answer more. But I do know that the Uni Co-op model in the U.S., at least the one pushed by the steelworkers, is definitely looking to the Mondragon Social Committee as its model, and that the idea is that the union in the U.S. should play the role of the Social Committee. But maybe Fred has some other inputs on that.
Great, cheers, John. So I'm going to wind this up now. So we finish at 10 past. And just one thing came to mind in that last bit as we were talking. There's a poem by T.S. Eliot, I think it's called The Rock, that speaks, and I can't exactly paraphrase it, but it's a thing that often comes back to me in these governance discussions. And the poem talks about people that are striving for systems that are so perfect that nobody needs to be good. And that's one thing that we really need to bear in mind with Sociocracy. It's a great way to work. It's a great operating system for co-ops and other organizations, but it still requires a lot of work, and it requires the development of a really positive culture.